So after spending months coming to Mass Sunday after Sunday, asking the Lord to give me a sign, to give me a miracle, nothing happened. I reached Ash Wednesday. That Ash Wednesday, I was determined to do something, to work for God's favor so that God will finally give me what I wanted. But every attempt at praying, every attempt at fasting failed. Days went by after that first day of Lent. And the failed fasting and praying attempt just led me to admit that which I had been resisting. That God did not exist, that there was no bread, there was no manna in the desert that I was in. Not for me, or not for anyone for that matter. People were just too naive to admit it. And I was wishing I was naive. Now, it was here for the first time in my life that I experienced what clinically you call depression. It was strange. And it wasn't so much a feeling of sadness, it was simply being empty, being numb, lacking motivation, lacking meaning, lacking purpose. And the things that once used to animate me, excite me, bring me life, sparked interest, made me think about the future and strive for something, all of that fell victim to indifference. And it is in that indifference that a new thought began to emerge inside of me. Would it be better to not exist? Now, that was a frightening thought, one I had never considered before, and it scared me to realize just how attractive that thought seemed. Now, I knew I would never do something to make it actually happen. Nonetheless, the thought was there. I remember thinking, well, now what? Now what do I do? I guess I'm going to have to start making my own oasis in this desert, come up with my own meaning, my own purpose, give my life my own direction, somewhere, somehow in this desert. You know, many people go through similar experiences in life. It happens very often as you're going from being a teenager to a young adult, as you're figuring your life, your place in the world, and you begin to question everything, especially those big questions of meaning. You question the faith that your parents tried to hand on to you, that gave you some sense of comfort. Now even that's up to the test. It also happens with a tragic life-altering event when it occurs. The sudden loss of a loved one, when an accident emerges, sudden illness, a pandemic. Many people were depressed during that time. It happens when your brain, your chemicals just aren't syncing up, mental illness. Any of those experiences can make life seem so unfair, so uncertain, so dull, undesirable. Now that's the desert experience. And that is the place where you are forced to face your worst fears. That's why Scripture often uses this image of the desert. It's universal. We all go through it in some way, somehow, different times of our lives. So what's the desert? It's where you're vulnerable, you're unprotected, you're exposed to the elements. It seems to lack everything and have nothing. There's no water. There seems to have no life, no food, no shelter. And all you see is the same thing. Dry nothing. It's also the place of temptation. Because once you are in that place, you either think of doing anything to escape it, or simply give up. And in that place is where God becomes either an obstacle or completely absent. Now, there's a lot of difficulties that come in your spiritual life when you have entered the desert. I've talked about two of them this past couple of weeks. The first week that we began reading John 6, I talked about the difficulty in prayer when God doesn't seem to be enough, when God doesn't seem to satisfy your own needs. Last week, the gospel allowed us to reflect on what happens when you try to work for God's favor. What do we have to do to get more of this bread? Tell me. And you put in the work, and yet nothing seems to come. And when we find ourselves in the spiritual desert, and we find ourselves having these difficulties in the prayer life, in our spiritual life, in our relationship with God, then the question simply becomes, what now? When there seems to be nothing, when God seems to be absent, when God seems to not care, what now? I'd like to look at Elijah's desert experience. Now, Elijah, he found himself in the desert due to a mental and spiritual difficulty that he was experiencing. God had called them to do something amazing. God called them to the adventure of his life. God called them to be a prophet, to help him, work with him, to go and speak against the false prophets. There was a god called Baal that people worshipped. And this Baal had a bunch of different prophets that would speak on behalf of him. They were leading many people astray, so God chooses Elisha, says, hey, I need you to help me. I need you to go and tell those prophets that they need to stop. Now imagine receiving a mission from God directly, and there's a conviction in your heart that, yes, this is something I can do. You know the stories of all of the prophets before you. You know what God has done through them. And you think, if this is something real, then this is something that's going to do great things in my life and in others. So he romanticized himself doing these things. He imagined himself just like Moses coming to them, and with the word of God in his mouth, being proclaimed, changing hearts. And he goes. He's motivated. When you start something new, you feel motivated, you're convinced. He was motivated. He goes, he begins to speak against the god of these false prophets, Baal, and he's successful. He defeats these prophets. But then everyone else turns against him. And now they want to kill him. He didn't think that was going to be part of the plan. So now he's feeling overwhelmed, overworked, and tired. Can anyone relate? Ever felt overwhelmed, overworked, and tired? And so then that excitement that he had at the beginning is now gone. That mission that at one point filled him with a sense of purpose and a sense of mission is now nothing but a burden. So much so that he approaches God and says, this is enough, Lord. I'm a failure. How foolish was I to think that I could be just like those prophets that I admired? How foolish was I to think I could be like my fathers, like Moses? He entered the desert. Depression. He found himself void of meaning, void of purpose, now wondering, what now? And he sees absolutely nothing, no options, which is why a new thought emerges in his mind. It would be better to not exist. Take my life. He prays for his own death. You know, depression and thoughts of suicide does not discriminate. It affects everyone. From the youngest to the oldest, rich, poor, believer, non-believer. As a priest, I get the privilege to speak with people in those most difficult of moments, and I see it in that spectrum. And like, it is in that moment, and for many who suffer with depression, that sometimes it's better to just sleep. To stop feeling nothing. Simply sleep. And that's what Elijah does. It says that he falls asleep under the broom tree. What is a broom tree? And why is it important that the author here tells us what kind of tree it was that he fell asleep under? I Googled it for you. I was really curious myself. So broom trees are these very delicate big bushes. They're not like big trees. They grow a good size for being a bush. And they're very delicate. They're not that hardy. They grow along these dry riverbeds, and the only reason they can survive is because they have incredibly deep roots. And so when there's a flash flood in the desert, this dry riverbeds get saturated, this water goes deep down into the soil, And there is just enough moisture deep underground for these trees to hang on to life and last until the next floods. Otherwise, they are gone. So here we have Elijah, a very delicate individual who has suffered greatly, driven now into this desert of despair, now resting under this delicate tree which is hanging on to life just like he's trying to hang on to life. Actually, he has given up in life. And yet, what this tree is allowing us to understand in this story, the lesson here, is that just as this tree has just enough to survive, and yet you cannot see it in the surface, in those difficult moments in life where there seems to be nothing else for you, nothing else for life, that somehow God is providing for you just enough to hang on until the next rains come. Now, at one level, you're like, well, nice, good, but I don't really like it. I mean, why, God, are you going to give me just enough in those most difficult moments of my life when I need you to give me a flood? Why give me just enough to survive, to get by day? Why not just do everything at once? Yet that is the case. Sometimes in the desert, God chooses to give you just enough to survive. And somehow to trust that God's promise is there for you too. That He will walk with you and that eventually He will give you more than you thought you needed. Now, accepting that takes a great deal of faith. And the most ironic thing is that in those difficult moments of your life, faith is what you feel like you have the least. So the question remains, what then? When faith and trust in God is missing in those most difficult moments of your life, and the only thing we have is this honest hopelessness, this is enough, oh Lord, just take my life, I cannot handle this anymore. If that is all we have, then that is what God will take. So the first step to overcoming difficulties in prayer, the first step to overcoming depression in a spiritual level, the first step to walking towards out of that desert, being led out of that desert, is honesty. Elijah was completely honest in how he was overwhelmed. And in that honesty, he is completely met in that insecurity, in that lack of self-confidence, in that tiredness. He rests under this tree, ready for God to take his life. And God takes his life, but not in the way that he expected, not by ending it. It says that he's awakened and there's an angel there and provides him with just enough food, with just enough water to last 40 days. He's barely hanging on to life, but in 40 days, he's finally able to exit that desert. God provided. So contrast that now to the gospel. And in the gospel, we have also people who are having a really difficult time. They have been having a difficult time for a long time. People were not happy with the way things were. People had been awaiting for a Messiah. So whenever a promising preacher came around, they all flocked to them. They wanted to see, can this person give me what I want? Here came Jesus. We saw 2 weeks ago that they came to him because they wanted to see more miracles. What does Jesus do? Simply feeds them. Last week, when Jesus fed them, they're looking for him again because they want to receive more food. And then Jesus says, the kind of food that you think I'm giving you to only saturate your bodily needs is not what you actually need. What you need is to have faith in me. They didn't like that. It didn't make sense to them. But instead of coming to Jesus with their doubts, instead of coming to Jesus with the fact that maybe they felt disappointed because he wasn't what they expected, what does the gospel say? They murmured among each other. They simply complained to each other. And right away, Jesus calls them out. He says, stop murmuring among yourselves. If you have doubts, if you have honest objections to what I am saying, come to me. Ask me. That is the kind of trust that God wants us to have with Him. That is what it means to be honest. So the invitation is clear. Faith does not mean not being unshaken. Faith does not mean never having doubts. Faith does not mean having difficulties in prayer. Faith is having the confidence to come to God no matter what you have to say. Faith is keeping it real. Being honest and direct with God. Faith is finding yourself willing to go under that broom tree. Which for us Christians, of course, this is the broom tree. And there's so many people that come to church in those most difficult of times, and they feel like they're just wasting their time here, but yet this is where they feel like they need to be, hoping, waiting for that flood. That's the invitation. That's what I did unknowingly when I was experiencing that difficult moment in my life when I was 18. I had nothing but my honest doubt, and I still kept coming to Mass even when I no longer believed. Maybe I still wanted to have a sense of hope, a glimpse of hope. And I would come and I would just simply give Jesus my unbelief. And I would complain, but I'd be here, doing my Catholic aerobics, standing, kneeling, sitting. Then I criticize those people around me who seem so devout, thinking, this is just in your head. But yet there I was, going along with it. Those first days of Lent turns into weeks of wandering in that desert, thinking, now what? Thinking I'm going to have to make my own meaning, find my own accomplishments, simply being a good person. Now, I didn't realize it then, but that honesty in which I kept coming under this broom tree, in that honestly, unknowingly, God was providing just enough of what I needed to not succumb to that idea or that thought of not existing anymore. That is part of the promise. That is part of the invitation. We all know someone who's maybe going through depression. We all go through that at some point of our lives. So if you ever find yourself in that desert, hang on to life. Stay under this broom tree. Even if it feels like there's nothing here, even if it feels like you're wasting your time, even if you feel foolish, a failure, hang on to life. You know someone who is in that place, let them know. Eventually, the rains come. Eventually, that flood comes. To be continued.